It's a huge honor. You've been involved in so many projects. You've been playing music for so many years, always with originality, and I think you always put your heart into something you do. But for people that don't recognize your beautiful glasses or your beautiful smile, who the hell are you, man?
My name is Franz Nicolay. I live in upstate New York, and I'm a musician and a writer.
Welcome to Prescription Punk Rock, my friend. Before getting into your music, I'm curious. Let's get back to when you were a kid. How did you start discovering music? And was people around you influence you where your parents were into music or how that journey started up?
Sure, my parents were visual artists, photographers. My mother was a photographer. My dad was uh, primarily a potter, a ceramics artist. They were, back to nature hippies in the early 70s. So I grew up in the middle of, in 50 acres of mountainous forest. Uh, without indoor plumbing. We had an outhouse and we had a little solar shower and, sort of hippie childhood in the woods. Um, I saw I don't know if you had the kids show Sesame Street over there.
Yes.
But I saw the violinist Yitzhak Perlman on Sesame Street when I was 5 years old and got really excited about it. My parents were not musicians, but they were, invested in art, and so they wanted to be supportive. They got me a violin and signed me up for violin lessons. I started playing piano a year later. Um, and pretty early on, I was interested in the idea that you could write your own music. Um, and luckily, I had a really supportive string of teachers who let me sort of, once I figured out what music notation was, I would just sort of write, I would compose and then play it and see what it sounded like. And they let me perform that at my little recitals. Um, and and that's how it started. Essentially, I started playing French horn when I was in elementary school, and then picked up guitar as you do in middle school, mandolin and accordion a little later. Um, but yeah, essentially, I started out wanting to be in a sort of elementary school way to be a classical musician, and then I discovered rock and roll when I got a little older, and there you go.
And I got corrupted.
Yeah, now I got tinnitus.
But it's great because when I listen to the music you were involved to, there's a lot of stuff. So I get it that there's that classical way of playing, but with all of your heart and passions, it brings something different. Is it
I
something
mean,
that you?
the other piece of it is I studied jazz piano in college. I had a sort of a split major in jazz piano performance and then classical composition. So I was never a classical pianist. I was interested in improvising and composing, and so uh, um, to the extent that I have any piano training, it's more jazz than classical.
Do you think like jazz is kind of punk rock in a way, the mentality? Music is so different, but I think that musician behind that, it's the same. Jazz was never reached the level of mainstream in a way. It's a cultural thing. You find it in movies and everything, but it's still, when you go to show, it's intimate. It feel like it's a small family that listen to jazz. Not everybody.
Well, that's now. I mean, there was a period from the 1920s through the end of World War II where jazz was the pop music in America, right? These were huge hits. These were million-selling records. The band leaders were big stars. I have a magazine up here called Band Leader Magazine, and it's sort of a fan magazine for the Paul Whitemans and Raymond Scotts of the world, including gossip columns about what sideman was moving to what orchestra and so on. So I don't think it's accurate to say that jazz was never pop music. It was, but then it made a turn away after World War II for a variety. I won't start lecturing now, but but it does make a conscious turn away from being pop music after the Second World War.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and so it's like punk in the sense that it's sort of a community. It's an identity community, but it's not like punk in that it does have an interest in sort of sophisticated harmony and technical achievement in a way that punk doesn't.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
The ideology of punk is that is that anyone can do it and pretty quickly. And the ideology of jazz has evolved into being something much more like classical music in the sense that you need years of technical training to understand and perform.
It's so interesting to learn. You're right. It's I never, it's one of the thing I never studied jazz, so it's interesting point. But you're right. I mean, like when I say punk, it's more the approach of being underground culture and living through the music and let the sound grow and never restrain yourself in doing something that others want.
Yeah.
I think it's the similar in those two things. Punk is the same. It's it being non-established and say but it I don't think that jazz was like about like fuck society and let's
No,
destroy the
no.
government and but I think it was kind of like it was so cultural that it became anti-cultural after that because it went back to it felt like underground, but I'm sure that there's place that jazz is still very popular.
Yeah, I mean, it had its moments of fuck society, right? Maybe like the free jazz, Black Power moment in the late '60s, Archie Shepp and Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think genres that emerge organically tend to follow a similar lifespan where they start as a kind of folk art. They start within a closed community as orally transmitted genres. So you're talking, jazz in the 1890s, 1900s in New Orleans is a folk art, and then it rises to a level where it becomes a mass art form. And punk does a similar thing. It emerges in particular communities as a kind of is a reactive impulse, right, in the late '70s, and then it sort of rises to its commercial peak in the '90s, and then retreats again to being a more niche taste.
When we look to music, after all, I think it's all vibration, and through time it creates subgenre, but we're all there because we love the vibration and it brings something to the brain. I'm curious, do you remember your first gig when you vibrate people around you and see their reaction to what you do?
Well, I performed as an elementary school. I remember very clearly the first time I ever got up with a guitar and sang in front of people, a song that I had written. I think I was in ninth grade. Um, and Yeah, I remember it. I don't have a story about it necessarily. I had written my first song and I got up in front of my school. It was a sort of like a school assembly talent show kind of thing. And I think, I was a pretty quiet kid in that school as a 15-year-old. And I think, you know, the impression I got was people being like, huh? That kid?
Yeah, because when you're young, you don't think that you can write songs and do music. It's not the norm. There's people doing it. I remember I went to sing La Bamba from
Uh-huh.
Richie Valens in front of the whole class. And that's when I learned that I was not a singer.
Yeah, and then a couple years later, as you do, I put together a band with some other kids at school and we did covers, and a couple originals. But it's just sort of like getting your training wheels bands, baby bands. It
But
wasn't until I'm, huh?
were you like really open mind to music when you were in high school? I'm 42. When I was in high school, there was style of music. If you were into metal, you listened to metal. If you were into punk, you were into punk. How was it in New York in high school? Were you more open mind because there's so much story and culture in New York?
Oh, I wasn't in New York in high school. I was in New Hampshire. So it was very rural. It was very isolated. This was before the internet. And so, the only information I got was through mass media. It was from the radio or it was from magazines like Rolling Stone or Spin or Musician, or it was from my music teachers. I had a music teacher in junior high and high school who had been a jazz and rock guy he had come out of the Berklee School of Music, so he turned me on to stuff like Mingus and Ellington, but also Randy Newman. Um, but otherwise, I didn't. I wanted to hear all kinds of things, um, but I wasn't necessarily. It was only stuff that I could. I wasn't part of an underground scene or anything. I would read about. You know, I would hear about Frank Zappa and I'd be like, oh, that guy sounds interesting. Let me, get a couple Frank Zappa records from the record store a half hour away in the small town, or there's this band, American Music Club. They're opening for Pearl Jam. They're going to be the hot new things. Oh, I got better go check out American Music Club. Or, my friend and I went to Lollapalooza in 1993. First on the stage is this crazy band, Rage Against the Machine, that no one's ever heard of. Oh shit, hey Ken, you buy the Fishbone record and I'll buy the Rage Against the Machine record, and we'll tape them for each other. That's that kind of thing. But there was no musical underground in northern New Hampshire. To the extent that there was, it was jam bands, which I wasn't interested in. I wasn't interested in the Grateful Dead or Fish or Dave Matthews or anything like that, and that's all that people were into around. So when I got to New York at 17, I was very ready to embrace being in a city environment where there was a lot of stuff going on. And my roommate, my freshman year in college, was from New Jersey. He was from New Jersey ska punk scene. And so he just opened me up to all kinds of stuff, and he started taking me to the all ages matinees at the Wetlands in downtown Manhattan. In terms of what he was interested in, it was stuff like he turned me on to all the Lookout bands. He was into Millencolin. He was into Mr. T Experience.
Oh,
And then like the moon ska thing was happening in New York at the time. So like the Slackers, the Scofflaws, Skahoovy and the Epitones, Mephistopheles, that kind of punk ska. And so I was going to those, they would have those on the same bills at the Wetlands essentially. And that was my first introduction to the punk scene. And I was just like, this is amazing. This is great.
yeah, I went twice in New York City and it smelled culture. It's such a cultural city. And yeah, there's so many history, like punk history is so important there. I mean, the Ramones and the CBGBs and every band around that, even band that were punk at the beginning, but went huge after that.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of city. So I'm sure like getting there with the background you have was really scary, but really
It
fun because
wasn't. I was so naive that I didn't even know to be scared. I just came in full of confidence, being like, "I'm going to take this city by storm." I'm going to send out my cassette demos and play First of Five on Bleecker Street and go to all the shows, and I was just ready to do it.
like people warn you like New York can swallow you. You were there like, come on, get me,
Yeah.
come and
No,
get
I'm
me.
gonna. Yeah, just wait till they get a load of me. But it was a transitional time, I think, for the kind of music that you're talking about, because the stuff like ABC No Rio and like Choking Victim hadn't quite started up yet. Uh, um, the squatter scene was there, but that was pretty underground. Um, so yeah, I mean, I was getting some of the New Jersey stuff and some of the West Coast stuff. But
Cool.
primarily when I was in music school, I was involved. Um, I was either playing my songs. I'd put a band together and I would gig in these shitty clubs on Bleecker Street. But then I was going to like the Knitting Factory and that sort of like cross genre avant garde jazz. John Zorn, Jim Black kind of world. That's what I was going out to see.
It's cool that you mentioned choking victim. I spoke with Squirt about Public Serpent like a couple of days ago. It's such an important, choking victim have such an important in history of skacore punk. In
Yeah.
they create a scene after all. But it's funny when you look at the story. They went in the studio and the first day they broke up, and they did the records with what they had, and I'm sure
Yeah.
nobody thought that they're gonna make history with that because it was a mayhem and a chaos, but it turned out to be a really important records, and it led to a huge scene like the Leftover Crack, and you've been into the world Inferno Friendship Society, and there's so much band in the crack rock city scene.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the next piece, I guess, that I graduated from NYU, and I was living on Avenue B, just down from Tompkins Square Park for a couple of years, and then moved to Williamsburg in 2000, and got hooked up with World Inferno. And you know, Jack and them being he was 9 years older than me. He had he was already had this whole life in Jersey punk, and so that was a real that was my entree into that world, and then into the touring world. They were the first. I had done a couple out of town shows with other bands, but they were the first band that I really did proper touring with. Um, and then and then we hooked up with Leftover Crack as sort of compatriots. We were the big punk band in Brooklyn, and they were the big punk band in Manhattan. And I played on Fuck World Trade, and then I sort of connected the dots between the moon ska scene that I had been a fan of and what they were doing. And the connection there being through Ara, who was their drummer, who had played with a bunch of those bands with Dave Hilliard and ended up being in the Slackers, and Alec had they had both been in ska bands before Leftover Crack came together. And so then I became sort of a hanger, not a hanger on, but an adjunct to the crack rock steady world. Like Sturgeon would just call me whenever he was making a record, be like, "Hey, can you come down and play some keyboards on these songs?" Or "Hey, we're doing a Tompkins Square show. Just bring your keyboard, bring your accordion, come on, jump up." So I ended up playing with Leftover Crack a bunch. I played with Choking Victim on their reunion shows a couple times. It's just like total chaotic situation.
Not surprised.
I just like roll up with my keyboard under my arm and my suit on with all these fucking ne'er-do-wells.
Yeah, I'm sure if you meet like a teacher you had like in university, like, "Oh, what are you doing?" "Oh, I play on the records called Fuck Will Trade." And
Yeah.
with band like Choking Victim and Leftover Crack. Like, "You're into crack." No, that's just the name of the band.
Well, it wasn't out of among the other students in the jazz program, there was a guy in my class, Rob Jost, who's still on the scene, who, he was the bass player in Skahooby and the Epitones. So he was the first guy that I knew who was in a band, and he was in one of these moon ska bands. And then we had this other guy who was a drummer in the jazz program, but he would go tour with this band, Harry Pussy, who was a noise, like a noisecore band. And so like I think a lot of people, there were some people who were there to be jazz musicians or to be classical composers, but there were a lot of people there like me who were just sort of like, this is going to be our foothold in New York, and we're just going to get a toolkit of some chops and some arranging skills, and then we're going to go out and join a band and go on tour.
Yeah. And when you get on tour, it's a huge reality check.
Yes.
How was the first tour you did? Like, being in a band and being involved in a band that have so much experience. Will it help, not make the mistake that those guys make like 10 years ago?
Well, I just had to, there was a little bit of a learning curve. World Inferno was not a popular band at that point. Like when I joined World Inferno, we would play for a couple dozen people at the Mercury Lounge, and so then we built it up to where we would play for 1,000 people at Warsaw or, Webster Hall. But at that point, it was a pretty low, small potatoes thing. And so it was very much DIY, punk touring. I think the first tour was we did maybe 10 days down the East Coast, like down to Atlanta and back. And I do remember the first show, we played at, it was either the Sidebar or the Old Auto Bar in Baltimore. And I didn't know you needed to bring a sleeping bag, for example. So we rolled up at the dude's house we were staying at, and I kind of looked around. I was like, "Oh, I hadn't thought about this. Where am I going to sleep tonight?" It's like, "Oh, okay, next time, note to self, bring a sleeping bag." Little stuff like that. But you gotta learn somewhere. You gotta have like an older sibling figure to kind of show you the ropes, or kind of be like, no, that's not cool. That's not how we do things. And Terry Cloth was good for that.
How's your discipline when it comes to writing? You know, you mentioned you were a writer. How how's how do you deal with that? Do you write every day, or you go when the flow is there, like catching a wave if you surf?
You mean for prose, for
Yeah.
writing words? Uh, it's like so. I keep all the time. My notebook is in my phone notes. So anytime I think of a phrase or I'm thinking of, I hear somebody say something that's like, wow, that's incredible vernacular. That what a cool way to say a thing. I'll write it down. Run across a phrase in a book that I'm reading, write it down in there. And then I transfer it all to a big slush pile on my laptop. And that's just like words. And so that can either, when I sit down to write a song or when I sit down to write pro fiction, it's that I'll print out that same 30, 40, 50 page document and have it next to me. And it can either end up in song lyrics or it can end up in fiction, depending what the project is. Because these days, because I'm trying to work in a couple different projects at a time, I sort of have projects in rotation. So it's like, okay, I did a solo record. Now the next thing is probably going to be to do prose. If the last piece of the prose I did was fiction, okay, it's time to do a nonfiction project. If I did a nonfiction project, okay, now it's maybe time to do a fiction project. So it's just sort of a cycle like that. So, and then, every 2 years, it'll be time to write Hold Steady songs. And so, I'll accumulate voice memos of anytime I have ideas for music too. And so if I'm sitting down to write songs, then it's like, I have an hour-long playlist of 30-second chunks of music. So I start scrolling through that. It's like, okay, sitting down to work, with a cup of coffee, time to write some Hold Steady songs. Let's scroll through all these voice memos and see what I can piece together. Or, time to write a new solo record. Let's scroll down through those voice memos and see what can work for me. Not everything that works for Hold Steady is going to work for me, and vice versa. But there is some overlap. And, like my last solo record has a bunch of stuff that, originally I pitched as Hold Steady songs. And, Craig has his, he'll go through everybody's submissions and see like, okay, I see where my vocals will fit on this. And then the rest of the stuff, okay, I'll take it back. If I think it's good, I'll reassign it to my solo record bin. So it's a little like that. You're trying to constantly produce raw material so that you're not sitting down to a blank page if you want to work on a project. So that's the day-to-day process, is accumulating these giant slush piles of raw material. And then it can be like, okay, now here's my giant bucket. Am I going to scoop it out and pour it into the Hold Steady bowl, into the fiction bowl, into the Franz solo record bowl? That remains to be seen usually.
It's so cool. Like, I mean, like you really let the universe like talking to you and create those songs around what people say to you and what you read, or it's like the universe put it some word there, hiding everywhere, and you decrypt it and you put it that code into something and create something that people will enjoy, change their life, and I'm sure I have a different vision than yours.
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. I mean, I'm constantly trying to tell this to my students, of just like have your antenna up at all times, you know, um, because yeah, the universe there's stuff coded in it all the time. And anytime you run across something that makes your head buzz a little bit, like fucking write it down. Because sometimes it doesn't manifest for years, you know, I have little bits of phrases that I've had around for 10 years. They don't have a place for it yet, but they will, because something buzzed around, my antenna went up at some point, just like talking to somebody before a show in Nuremberg in 2011, somebody said something that was like a cool turn of phrase and I filed it away and someday I'll use it, or maybe I won't, but it's like it goes in the stew.
Yeah, your
But if
spidey
you're
sense are tingling.
but it's also, it's a way around writer's block.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times, because I have a day job as a teacher now, and I teach writing, I teach songwriting, I teach some other things. And, I these students will say, oh, I have this assignment, but I don't know what to write about. I'm staring at this blank page. It's due, in 48 hours. And it's like, don't put yourself in that position, right? Not that you necessarily have to be writing something every day, but you should be in a position to be collecting every day. So that when you sit down and you have an assignment, or or you have a project you want to do, the blank page isn't staring at you. Instead, what's staring at you is this playlist of voice memos and this printout of all the little bits and pieces of words and ideas that you've had over the last couple of years. And then you've got stuff to work with. Then you start, collaging things together.
Wow, this is something that you're right. It's less scary to have a lot of words in front of you than a blank page. And I
Exactly.
do a lot of reviews, and I know when you start, you're like, oh man, I have nothing, and you write and you erase and you write, and you get frustrating in that process. But if you have, like you said, a lot of words, it's just finding, and you don't start with the frustration. You just let go the flow and find something around that. That's wow, that's brilliant, man.
Well, it's the same thing. I've done some book reviewing, and it's a similar thing with that. Like, you're reading the book, you're trying to, you don't want to get to a point where you've read the book and you're sitting down and saying, okay, what did I think of that book? Or what did I think of that record? No, you're making notes as you go. You're underlining stuff, you're scribbling in the margins. You get to the end of it and you type up all your notes, and that's the beginning. That's going to be the beginning of your review. Then you're just filling in the bits in between, the thoughts that you had in the moment of experiencing. It's all just tricks to keep you from having to face a blank page. It's much easier to edit than write. And so if you can just get a bunch of garbage on the page, on the screen, whatever it is, you can treat it, it's always easier to see what needs to be done with someone else's work. And so if you can sort of trick yourself into thinking that first draft is someone else's work, then it's easier to fix.
Uh, you know, it's such a rewarding thing to be a teacher. When you see those eyes and those people, those young people that want to learn, want to have knowledge, and the curiosity, how it change your perspective of life of being a teacher.
Yeah, well, sometimes, I mean, there are that's the romantic way of doing it. Sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating because you get a couple of those great students, and you get a couple students who obviously don't want to be there and aren't, you know, just, can barely be bothered to show up, much less do the reading. And
Yeah.
then a bunch of, everything in between. How did it change my perspective? Um, I started teaching at a similar point in my life when I became a parent. And so both the combination of those two things, if you're a touring musician, you can age with it. The people who put on shows and attend shows are always going to be in that sort of like 18 to 25-year-old range, even as you age out of that. So it's very easy not to notice all of a sudden that you're 35. If you're always, if you're on, especially if you're on these DIY tours, it's like the promoters are always, 22, 23, and they're, or the people at the shows. And so it wasn't until I walked into a college classroom for the first time where I was like, oh, I'm actually 15 years older than these people, and I do have some, I felt insecure about asserting a kind of authority or a kind of knowledge. But you realize quickly, okay, I do know some things that seem obvious to me that are not obvious to these people. And also, especially having young kids, you can sort of get used to the idea of a kind of authority in the terms of, like, you have to do this, you can't do this. And so the combination, there's an aspect of sort of becoming comfortable with what I know and what I feel like I can impart, and also becoming comfortable with what I don't know and not trying to pretend that I know something, um, um, in the sense of some idea of being defensive of my authority. that it's okay to be like, hey, I know this really well. This other thing I don't know really well. Why don't you go research it and come back, and we'll fill in those gaps together. The other thing is, people say that writing is a good way of figuring out what you think. That usually people think they have ideas, that they have opinions, but they can't really articulate them because they've never had to articulate them. And writing is a way of doing that. But also teaching is a way of doing that. And so, when I started teaching a songwriting workshop, for example, it's a good way of systematizing the ideas that I had about song form, about the development of song form, about how to write a song, about what makes an effective song, but also not to be so prescriptive about those ideas that they can't apply across genre lines. I want to be able to talk about songwriting in a way that's as applicable to someone who's writing folk-based verse chorus songs with an acoustic guitar as someone who's writing, additive groove and loop-based songs on Ableton. And so it's a really good way to sort of distill and become confident in the ideas you have about a certain topic. Or for example, I teach this popular music, this sort of survey course, history course on American popular music, which is a really good way of defining what I think is important about American popular music. What are the various strands and how are they related, and how does it map onto racial divides and cultural divides and identity divides and class and education divides, and all this stuff that you maybe have some half-formed ideas about. You have to actually have fully formed ideas if you're gonna communicate them to a 19-year-old in a classroom setting.
Wow, it's so true. It's so true. I'm curious, is it more hard with time to create music for your solo career or for the old steady thing? Is it more hard or it's more easy with times?
I mean, my scheduling is different. When I was a freelance musician at 29, 30, 31 years old, I didn't have another job. So I could have a couple projects that I was working on any given moment. I could have a writing project. I could be working on solo songs. I could be working on hold steady songs. And particularly when I became a parent, the big adjustment was now I had a job, I had kids, and I could have one creative project at a time. And I had to finish that project before I could start another project. And that's how I got to that sort of rotation of projects that I was saying before. It's like, okay, now it's time for a writing project. Now it's time for a music project. Now it's not, I had one at a time because the amount of time you have is limited. I think eventually become more efficient with your time, where, once it wasn't like, okay, I'm waking up and I have all day stretches before me to do whatever I want to work on that day. Instead, it became, you have all these other responsibilities and maybe you can carve out 2 hours to work on the creative project. Well, you have to really use those 2 hours efficiently, as opposed to the old version of it where you're dicking around, you're taking a nap, you're making coffee, you're snacking. Ideally, you get that same amount of work, that same 2 hours of work done that you used to get over the course of 8 hours. You can compress that into the 2 hours that you have available to you. Is that true? I don't know. I'd like to think I've been able to keep up a similar level of production that I did 15 years ago, and a similar quality of production. That's not for me to say necessarily. I think you become a more sophisticated artist the longer you do it. That doesn't necessarily correlate to, I think, people responding to it as quickly. But I am sort of the opinion, you'll hear this among rock fans a lot. I like their early stuff better. Their first couple records are better. I haven't listened to anything after their fifth record.
Yeah.
And I think that's I think you know, obviously sometimes that's true, especially in group creative settings. You know, sometimes in a band setting where everyone's contributing. Yes, okay, you stumble on a sound, and then there's diminishing returns. Um, Individual creators, I think that, you know, that's less likely to be true because you're more it's easier to move on from a signature sound. You know, people talk about Bob Dylan or Neil Young or you know, Prince or these people who or David Bowie who can keep on reinventing themselves. Well, the way that they can do that is they're not tied to a band. You know, if they want to get a new sound, they can hire new musicians. It's harder for bands to do that because it has to be a group decision and it has to be a move that everyone is capable of at the same time. And so the bands that can do that, you know, U2, Radiohead, are that's a rare thing because, you know, you're by nature, by the very nature of it, you're going to be leaving an established fan base behind. So there's that pressure. Um, but you're also everyone has to be on board with the adjustment, and not everyone can follow in that way. Um,
Wow. It's such an interesting point. I wish Zoom give me more time. I hate it for that. It's the best way for recording, but I only have 45 minutes, but it's not true. I think they actually did, like, they gave you 38 minutes.
well,
But we will
do
have
you
to
want to
do it.
stop and restart, and then you can edit it together if you want to keep talking.
I would love to because there's a lot to talk about. So I'm gonna send you another link right now to the mail because yeah,
Okay,
there's so much. It's so fun talking to you, friend.
okay.
So we'll get
I'll
back
talk to you
for the
shortly.
part two, and we're back at it.
Okay. I don't have unlimited time, but I do want you to get to the end of all the questions you have.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it because yeah, it's really interesting because like I said, like you've been involved in so many projects, but we were talking about the songwriting, and if it was more hard or easy with time. But yeah, I'm curious, like when you write a songs, what make you feel it's done? Because we can write and try to perfect a song forever, but what's the limit you gave to yourself?
Um, I think you do get a sense about well, that's a okay. How to answer that? You get a sense for what the weak points of a thing are after you've done it you know, however many hundreds of times. Um, and that's part of I think the idea of maintaining a consistent practice, but also it's about being honest with yourself. Usually, when you write something, whether it's prose or a song, you can tell where the part is that's not quite working. And I think what I get, you know, when you're younger, sometimes you have this kind of magical thinking that maybe people won't notice. I get this with the students sometimes, like they know the part of the story that's not working, but it seemed hard and they were just hoping it was good enough. And it's like part of the workshop process is like, no, everybody can see the part that's not working. You know, your sense is good, your instinct is correct. You're just a little bit lazy. And so part of and part of becoming, I think, a mature artist is being the taskmaster to yourself to identify those parts that you know in your heart of hearts need more work. Um, that's reminding me to write down. I had a thought yesterday for a word in a song that needed to be different. I'm making myself a post-it note.
The
Um,
genius working, guys. You see it
yeah.
live. He's not
um,
lying.
but you know, with songs, part of that is not being too quick with them. You know, I think songwriters, especially younger songwriters, have this tendency to romanticize the first thought, best thought immediacy of it and identify that with a kind of authenticity, and to be suspicious of editing after the fact. Um, and I think it's the same thing as for poets. I think it was Wordsworth who said, poetry is, might not have been Wordsworth. Poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility, right? So that you write the first draft when you're in the heat of the emotion, but to turn it into a piece of art, you have to then edit it from a place of tranquility. And it's especially when I'm working with younger writers, there can be this sense of like, I was in the midst of a heartbreak and I wrote this song and I can't bear to edit it because that wouldn't be true to myself and that raw feeling. It's like, okay, well, the raw feeling is what gives you the first draft, but the molding of that raw feeling is what turns it into a piece of art. And so to be able to be sort of honest with yourself about what the weak points from an audience perspective are going to be. So, I'll do a lot of demoing of songs just for myself, record a version and then keep it in my headphones for a couple weeks. Because you feel good about a song in the office, in the home studio, and then put it in your headphones and go out for a run or go out for a drive. And pretty quickly you'll see, oh, this needs a bridge, or this, that second chorus only needs to happen one time, or there's an outro that could happen here. You just sort of like, if this was someone else's song, what would I be feeling like it needs? So there's that aspect of it. And then performing it live a couple times is always helpful too. Because you get a sense of what feels natural coming out of your mouth. And if a line feels awkward, or if a line is hard to memorize, sometimes that's your body telling you that the lyric needs to be finessed a little bit. Or, sometimes I've written a hook line that has a lyric that changes a little bit every time. And sometimes I want to maintain that for the sake of literariness, but sometimes for the sake of chorusness, it's better, or it's just for the sake of memorizing.
Yeah.
It's easier if it repeats, stuff like that. That gives it a little time, okay, get the first impulse of inspiration out of the way, but then give yourself a long period of time to edit it and tweak it.
Like people, that interview is important. Take notes. There's a lot to learn. We have that knowledge of a teacher, and it's such interesting point that you mentioned. You're right. And we tend to not want to read ourselves too much, but that's the only way to really see the mistakes. But you have to take a step back to do that and be in another state of mind, not being on that emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're right, you'll see like, oh, that I went too far or whatever. And I think that music is a living thing too. You got more ID coming, and if you let the process creating more longer, you can add great thing into it. And I think the details are really important. And yeah, right, people like they see that.
But it's part of becoming an older songwriter too. I think, moving, you can get a little more perspective. You're not quite so precious about your work. You can step back. You're familiar with what your own tropes are. I think that's a really important thing for artists to know, is like, oh, what are the chords that I'm always defaulting towards just because my hands like them? Or am I always, going to the sixth chord for a bridge? Well, maybe I should, learn what your own cliches are so that you can avoid them in the future, or at least be consciously using your own cliches. But you have to have written a certain number of records to have cliches at all. Um, but also, doing things like moving away from IU songs. Sometimes I think that young songwriters have to write their first 100 songs before you can tell them anything, because they want to get all this stuff off of their chest. And
Yeah.
a lot of it is IU songs, like I did this, you did that to me is a big part of the genre. Um, and a lot of that is also relying on a certain kind of vagueness in the kind of words you use. I get this with young songwriters that I'm working with a lot, where I'll pick out a line and I'll say, that sounds nice. There's something like, vaguely poetic about this words, but what does it mean? What do you mean by these words? And they don't know. You know, it's just words that came to them and they sounded kind of cool, or they sounded kind of sophisticated, or they sounded kind of poetic. And they default into this defensive posture of, well, it means whatever you want it to mean. It's like, okay, that's fine, but you should know what it means.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what it means, then it means you're being a little bit lazy.
Songwriting is so important for me. That's the first thing I look to, and after that, if I love the melody, I've got the song in my head, and I listen to maybe more than other songs. But one of my favorite songwriters is Greg Graffin. I think he
Mm-hmm.
really stand what he write for, and he was totally devoted to that and being better at it. But I'm curious, where was or what your favorite songwriters are?
Well, and Greg Graffin was also he was an academic also, right? So he's got that sort of uh, framework in terms of being rigorous with himself.
Yeah.
Um, and I should also say that there are people who are not lyrics people. I happen to be a lyrics person, so I'm often focused on the lyric part of it. But I think all this applies also to the chords and the harmonies, like to try to identify, you know, and harmonically analyze your own songs so you understand what sort of tropes that you're and cliches that you're doing without realizing you're doing it. Like, yes, of course, certain chord progressions are always going to sound good to you, but that doesn't mean you should write the same song over and over again. Or, what does it sound like? Figure out what scale tone melodically relative to the harmonies that you're always starting your melodies on, and see what happens if you start your melody on the second tone or the sixth tone or the seventh tone instead of just the 1 3 5 triad tones. And how does that knock your songwriting out of its ruts? What was your question?
What was
Sorry.
your favorite songwriting? Who
Oh,
are?
the first songwriter that really blew my brain open, I think, this is a very basic answer, but was Bob Dylan. This is the first one for whom I was like, oh, this, you can do this. um, and then a guy called Mark Eitzel, who was in a band called American Music Club and then had some solo records.
Yeah.
Um, he was big for me. Yeah, those were the first two as a teenager, in terms of like what are the capabilities of songwriting from a lyrical point of view.
And did you saw the documentary about We Are the World with Bob Dylan in it?
I'm about half an hour into it. I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to watch the rest of it as soon as we're done here.
Nice, nice. I love it. He's such a legend, and people forget that it's not because you're a musician that you're social, and I think is
Hmm.
is a good example of, yeah, you can go sing in front of a lot of people, but still you're that misfits when you get off the stage, and you not being antisocial. It's just that it's in you.
Awkwardness. Yeah. I mean, I think he's what we were talking about lines that you put down and you don't know what they mean. I think he's an example of that, especially in those 60s recordings, where he's said in interviews like he can't access that part of himself anymore. He was doing a lot of speed. That's probably a big part of it. um, and he doesn't, he does some editing, but he doesn't do that kind of rigorous editing. I mean, this is a critique um, that Leonard Cohen has made, and I think Paul Simon also has made of Dylan, is that he doesn't edit himself enough, or he didn't edit himself enough in terms of knowing what every line meant in the he has some lines that are obviously in there just because they sounded cool, and just because he was channeling something, either because of the amphetamines or because of whatever high he was on during that period of time. um, but I do think that that's one of those reasons why, um, me as a Dylan fan, I don't go back to those 60s recordings. I think they were important in terms of expanding people's sense of what pop songwriting could be, what folk-based songwriting could be, you know, in that sort of stream of consciousness beatnik imagery. but I don't necessarily though think that those are his best songs as songs in terms of the rigor as literary products.
I would tend to agree with you.
So when I'm going to Dylan, I'm going, honestly, I'm much more likely to listen to his last 25 years, like the post Time Out of Mind records. I think, um, and part of that is about overexposure to the 60s records, but part of it is because I do think he became a more rigorous songwriter.
I'm curious. A lot of people say that Kurt Cobain for our generation was one of the greatest songwriter. I think we got Billy Joe Armstrong too, that is considered a great songwriter. What you think as a teacher? Do you think that they deserve that title?
Cobain and Billy Joe.
Yeah.
Um, I yeah, that's interesting. I think of Billy Joe Armstrong more as a pop craftsman, in the same way that Paul McCartney is a pop craftsman, in terms of putting together hooks and traditional song form. And I think Billy Joe has talked about his relationship to the Beatles. Obviously the primary influence is the Ramones, but he's got a bigger harmonic palette than the Ramones, and I think a lot of that has to do with the Beatles. Um, I think he is not a lyricist in the way that I'm usually interested in lyricists as literary form. But I think he has obviously he can express things in a very accessible conversational way that connects with people, right? Which is not a gift that some of the people that I look to have, or that I have necessarily. And that's as a pop artist, as a popular artist, um, he's doing something different. Song form is like movies, in the sense that there are movies that are meant to make millions of dollars and appeal to a wide swath of people and speak to a wide swath of people. And there are movies that are meant to be fine art objects, that are meant to be slow moving, 7 hour long art pieces. And they're both called movies, but they're very different things. And I think, what Billy Joe Armstrong does is much more in the vein of a pop craftsman, like a Spielberg, as opposed to a French experimental filmmaker, like a Scott. That's more like what a Scott Walker does. Um, Kurt Cobain as a songwriter is not someone I've thought a ton about, because I just feel like what he did was something very different than what I do, or what the people I'm interested in do. So it's like tightly crafted. It's expressionist. It's about the emotion more than the literal meaning of the words. And I think, as I've probably expressed in this interview, I'm more interested in the craft of the words than in the raw emotion necessarily.
Yeah, I get you. I was curious because when it come to pop culture, because they went to pop, people sometimes that idea of and I will totally agree with you. They're both good songwriters, but it's not like Dylan or like you said, and it's a good metaphor. I study in cinema, so yeah, I'm not into the Marvel movies. That's the pop cultures, and it's a wheel, and then they follow the trends and everything. I'm more
Well, I
into
guess
something.
I'm talking less about Marvel movies, because that's more just like disposable pop culture. That's like an Ariana Grande would make, or something like that would maybe be the analogy. But there's a kind of movie that's like, it's artistic, but it's well crafted. It's craftsmanlike, but it is meant to be broadly accessible. So that's why I'm thinking about someone like Spielberg, or you know something like Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan, um, where it's like the main point, there's a style to it, there's an artistry to it, but the main point is not to be a fine art object, it's to be a popular art object. um, and so I think of that in terms of people like Billy Joe, or in terms of people like Taylor Swift, or Max Martin, the Swedish songwriter, where it's like there's a craft to it, there's a real craft to it, and I respect that craft. I have a ton of respect for that craft, in the same way that I respect, the classic American songwriters like the Gershwins or Cole Porter. They were trying to write hit songs, or Lieber and Stoller, or Carole King and Jerry Goffin, the Brill Building, right? But there's a craft to it, there's an art to it, but the main point is to have hits and to reach a popular audience, as
Yeah.
opposed to people whose primary focus is a kind of fine art focus, and so who sometimes accidentally have popular hits.
One of my favorite, it's Stokey from Streetlight Manifesto. I think it's such an underrated writers, and when you read the lyrics, it's amazing. Like when you
Totally
see,
agree, and
like
I
it's
love
it's like
Bandits of the Acoustic
3 page
Revolution.
of
Yeah,
lyrics.
yeah, I love that Bandits of the Acoustic Revolution stuff particularly. I think that's a really neat reimagining of ska punk.
Yeah, I think so. I think they're one of the best, and they really push it to another level. And the fans are so cool. When you go to Streetlight Manifesto show, they're very. It's not just it's not the typical punk scene. It's so much range of people. It's so cool.
Yeah, I was emailing with him years ago. We were trying to do a thing with Streetlight and World Inferno, and it just never came together, which is a little too bad.
Yeah, big bummer. You release what's gonna be like 2024 for you? Like you mentioned, the cycle you released last year, records with old. So how's gonna be the rest of the years?
Yeah, the big thing for today is for this year is I have a new book, a nonfiction book. It's going to come out in September. It's called Band People: Life and Work in Popular Music. It's I interviewed 80, 90 people who are, like myself, like long-term workers in band world. So, but not front people. So bass players, keyboardists, second guitarists, background singers. Um, in terms of like this thing that we call a band is such an interesting sociological entity because it's a combination of small business, chosen family, creative collaboration, group hierarchy, but usually an unstated hierarchy, that in a lot of cases is formed by young people who don't know what they're doing, and then they sort of have to live with the consequences as grown people with careers. And so I was really interested to talk to people about how they conceptualize their role, as a band person, um, as a working rock musician. Um, and so that book's gonna, and that's taken me a bunch of years to write. So I'm glad that that's finally going to come out. That's going to be on University of Texas Press in September.
Yeah,
Um,
that
and
that that was my next question. If people want to encourage you by the book you wrote, the music, is there a web page? What's the best way to directly encourage you?
Yeah, franznicolay.com, FranzNicolay.com has links to everything. I've got to all three of the books, to my solo records, to some of the other side projects. Yeah, that's the way. FranzNicolay.bandcamp.com has all of my records. Um, I think that's the answer. I'm trying to
Yeah,
do a. I'm trying to book a German tour in August of some solo shows. I don't know if that's going to come together. I guess that's up to Felix. Um, but that's my desire. I'm hoping to come back sooner than later.
you hear him. But that would
Yeah.
be great. Germany is such an interesting place. People are, they're really intelligent people. They spoke like three language currently, and yeah, the scene there is amazing. The only thing that it seemed, I said it seemed, but it's like that. I spoke with a lot of band, but they're not like united together to create a scene. They're all doing their thing, all around, but they don't really know each other's, and it's not like New York was back in the days.
But there's an intellectual and political seriousness around German punk rock, and European punk rock in general. I mean, this is sort of part of what my first book, The Humorless Ladies of Border Control, was about. Um, but German touring with World Inferno was my first experience with overseas touring. The squat circuit, And so I have a real affection and sort of a deep identification with that kind of touring.
Yeah, I tried to learn German in college. It's a really, really tough language. I lost almost everything. Mein Name ist Erik Bedar, ich tu not spreche Deutsch.
Yeah. And also just like again, like the political seriousness. When I first started touring, I was really impressed by the political engagement. The Antifa action, and all that was really alive in Germany in the aughts in a way it wasn't in the United States in the same way. It didn't. I think at that point it didn't feel as necessary in the United States or as immediately relevant in a way that maybe it does now.
Yeah, I think with their culture and the whole Europe, when you've been through war, it stay in. I think it's in the mentality of questioning and trying not to go there again. So they're really ready to react, and we see that now. With the former. Standing up against government and so yeah, I think we lost that through the last maybe 15 years because when you look at the second wave of punk, they were really political. But
Yeah.
bands like Black Flag or Bad Brains or Minor Threat or they stand against the government and what's established, but we lost that. And I think that band now are really afraid to speak their mind because the cancel thing and getting on social media and being attacked by a lot of people. And I don't know, but we restrain ourselves, I think.
Well, I think there's also a question of, the generation of punk bands that I was deeply involved with in the aughts. The political movement of the day was about opposition to the Iraq War, and my takeaway from that, and I think a lot of us, our takeaway from that was how little impact it made. And I wonder if there's a question about like what is the point of political punk rock, or what is the utility of political punk rock? And maybe with the political situation the way it is in the world now, that's for another generation of punk rockers to figure out. But I will say, in terms of like the German punk scene, there's this joke among American bands about the critique of the German fan, about how challenging, how the German punk fan will come up and challenge you about, your last record was not as good.
Yeah, no effects like really nail it on one songs.
But I always sort of appreciate that because it speaks to the seriousness. It speaks to like taking punk rock seriously, and the idea that that you should be able to critique yourself and look at yourself and say, is the work I'm doing as good as the work I did before? What are the cliches? What are my personal cliches that I'm falling into, and so on. So I I share the joke, but I kind of admire it.
Yeah, you were good on your last record, but now you get.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Yeah,
yeah.
last time you came through on tour, the shows were much better. You seemed tired. It's like, okay, I didn't sleep very well. You
Yeah,
got me.
they really speak their mind. Yeah, I remember like when Pizzo Weezo got to the Rock Fest, we watched NoFX with Axel, and he was really critique about how they play and explain me why it's not like back in the days and what's lacking and what they should do. And I was like at some point like, do you really like how can you enjoy a show being so critic? And he
Yeah,
laughed. He said, "Yeah, it's a German thing."
but it's taking it seriously as an art form, in the same way that you would read a novel and critique it, or you would go to an art museum and critique the paintings, and sort of, take a band seriously as an artistic entity that has a creative arc. So that I appreciate.
Yeah, I think you have to take your work seriously, just not yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
It was such a cool thing to do with you. I mean, it's one of the greatest interview I ever done, man. First, the knowledge. I really learned a lot through that interview, and I'm sure a lot of people too. Thank you so much. Of course, we're gonna wait for you in Quebec. It would be great to have you here And now I'm calling the Poudza, Volley Macadam, every festival around Quebec. That would be great to have friends here.
Okay, tell them to they know where to find me. I'd love to come play.
Yeah, or write me. I know how to find him.
Okay.
Another reason to go to New York. It's been a
Yeah.
while. Love the city.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. Nice talking to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Prescription is what you need. No more inhibition.